Thank you, Julie. I'm not going to introduce you again because I don't think I can do better than Emily, but I would like to welcome Pattie Sellers. Come on up, Pattie. So Pattie is the assistant managing editor of Fortune and oversees the most powerful women's conference series, and which brings together the most powerful women in the world, from Mary Barra to Michelle Obama. And she's had over 20 covers at Fortune and has written about more high-achieving women than anyone else. In fact, she was the first person to discover a little-known executive from Lucent named Carly Fiorina back in 1998, and then decided to put her on the cover the next year. That summer, Carly became appointed HP CEO. So do not underestimate Pattie's power. Go Pattie. We also have Heidi Messer, who is an entrepreneur and investor who has founded several global businesses, including Linkshare in 2005 for $425 million. And she's also most recently founded Collective Eye, which analyzes big data to help companies grow revenue. She's also on the board of Alliance Bernstein, as well as a number of other advisory boards, including Dell, American Express, and my favorite, the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Johns Hopkins. Go Heidi. So I could not be more excited. I've been telling everyone about this panel. Actually, I've been telling everyone about all of our panels for all year, but I am so excited that you're all here. Thank you for taking the time. These women are leaders from the tech world, the media world, the social responsibility world, and each has a global impact. And they regularly hang out with the likes of Warren Buffett, Reid Hoffman, Ginny Rometty, and Sheryl Sandberg, but each of them takes time to give back to the community. And so, as we say at ChIPs, they all pay it forward, so thank you for that. So I am going to start with Heidi. Heidi, only because she actually does still have an active bar membership, so I'm really thrilled we got you MCLE credit today. So after graduating from Harvard Law, you worked at big law for 2 years, took your big, huge paycheck home, and then suddenly decided to quit and start a business with your brother. So what possessed you to do that? And was it part of some grand plan? And by the way, somebody told me that you feigned an English accent when you started the company.
I did.
Do tell us about that.
I'm glad everyone has wine for this story.
Sure.
Makes me feel good that everyone's having a good time. And Mallun, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. If I ever knew then that I'd be sitting in front of this group of women, with this group of women, I would have quit sooner. So for me, I was the black sheep in my family. I come from a family where everyone on the family tree is an entrepreneur. When I got into Harvard Law School, my family was mortified. They actually didn't even go to my graduation. Lawyers were the big enemy. So I always tell people the only way you can rebel in a family of entrepreneurs is to go to law school. But the law school education for me was actually quite painful. If you think about what entrepreneurs do, it's all about risk-taking, and much of what a legal education is about is spotting risks so you can avoid them. And if you think about the practice of law, no one ever gets an award for all the risks that they stop people from taking, right? No one ever says, thank you for helping me avoid that disaster. It's just sort of expected. And I always was a person that wanted to take risks. So when I was in this environment where I felt like every single move I was going to make, I might make a mistake, it actually inhibited a very strong part of my personality. In fact, it's so funny, when I quit, I wish there had been a group like this. The managing partner told me that I was ruining my career, that I was on a trajectory to be a partner in the law firm and I should stick it out. So it was actually a very,
we have refreshments.
I told you, they must know the story's going on too long.
Heidi.
So thank you very much. This is the best panel to be on. Definitely. Cheers. See what happens? Cheers. When you get entrepreneurs on a panel, everything, all hell breaks loose. So,
just so civilized.
So did that answer your question?
Yeah. You didn't tell us about the English accent.
So,
And can you do it for us?
I can do it for you. So, so it's very interesting listening to the panel about bias in hiring. And one of the biases a lot of people have is when you're starting a company, you have no one, you obviously have no credibility. So if you don't have someone answering your phones, that's problematic. But I figured out that people give a lot of weight to British accents. They, for some reason, think that you're much more legitimate. So I would have to answer the phone and then transfer it to myself, which is a problem if you are talking to the same person who answers. So I would do this, good morning, Linkshare. Oh, just hold a moment. And then I would transfer the phone and say, hello, in like as much of an American accent.
Oh my gosh.
So you wouldn't know that we didn't have a receptionist.
That is awesome.
This is not the story I wanted to tell in front of Pattie, but shattering all of the images that she probably had.
It's going in a story someday. I promise you.
Okay, to Julie, you were born in Egypt and then fled Jordan after a line of tanks fired on your school during a civil war, and then you fled Lebanon when another civil war broke out, and then at the ripe old age of 10, you find yourself in the middle of Alabama, as you told me, that foreign family. You decided at the age of 16 to study computer science. What was going through your mind at that point? You had been through so much, and you picked computer science. Did you know where you wanted to end up?
Well, at the risk of betraying how old I am, at the time, hardly anybody knew what computer science was or what you did with it, and I certainly didn't. It was all quite accidental, and I was far too young to be going to college, and I didn't really know what to do. I was sort of a little clueless and a little bit lost, and my mom said, well, you're so good in math and science, and there's this new field called computer science. You should check it out. And so I guess the moral of the story is always listen to your mother. I don't know. It's kind of ironic because I never, ever, ever listened to my mother, and that's one of those rare occasions where I did, I think probably because I was so lost and desperate. And the interesting thing about studying computer science was that it was a real struggle. It was very abstract. You didn't know what you were going to do with it. You were trying to figure out, is it going to lead to a life worth living? Am I going to be miserable in a job? And fortuitously, I discovered, it was basically life spent in a computer lab, and one day I stumbled across this little program called email. And at the time, email's old school now. At the time, nobody knew what email was. It was just something that as techies used in the labs. But what struck me right away was that this idea, much in the same way that we think of Facebook and Twitter today as a revelation in terms of their reach, this idea that you could send a message to theoretically an infinite number of people around the world in an instant just was inherently so powerful, and that it could potentially give power to people who didn't have it. And that was really the spark. I became convinced that email was going to be something we used like the phone one day. Everybody thought I was crazy at the time, but basically that got me started on being part of this small group of people that brought email to the world, and I spent the next 20 years basically doing one form of that or another.
So if you listen to your mom, you can be like
Yes.
Julie. I'm going to use that with my daughter and my son. So thank you. Pattie, 2 years after graduating from college, you end up at Fortune, and you've been there ever since. So in 1998, about the same time you wrote about Carly, you came up with this idea of the 50 most powerful women's list. And tell us about what motivated you to start this. Did you think that it would become this huge franchise that it's become?
So it was not my idea. How many of you are familiar with the Fortune Most Powerful Women list? Okay, that's pretty good. So this is something we started at Fortune in 1998, and I had done a couple of cover stories about women leaders that got a lot of attention, sold well on newsstands, which we actually used to talk about and we don't talk about anymore, but we always used to look at our newsstand numbers. And one of the top editors at Fortune, actually, the number 2 editor, a guy, said, we should do a list. We should do an annual list. And up until then, Fortune was Fortune was already kind of the king of lists among magazines because we had the Fortune 500, we had best companies to work for, we had most admired companies, but all of those lists were either quantitative by the numbers as the Fortune 500 is, biggest companies by revenue in America, or a survey. This was going to be the first list about people that we'd ever done, and the first list that wasn't by the numbers. And I'm sitting in this meeting in the summer of '98, and I said to the number 2 editor at Fortune, I said, all right, but we have to rank them. Everybody in the room was like, how are we going to rank these women? I said, if we don't rank them, guys will not read it. Because guys are into rank and status and size and whatever, right? And so they're like, how? I said, we developed criteria. So we developed 4 criteria: the size and importance of the woman's business in the global economy, the health and direction of the business, the arc of the woman's career, and social and cultural influence. Social influence meant something different in 1998 than it means today. But those are the criteria we set, and those are the criteria we follow today. And in fact, Mallun, it was the very first Most Powerful Women issue in September 1998 that I went out to Lucent in New Jersey, and Lucent was a very hot telecom company at the time, and I actually went out there mainly to interview Pat Russo, who ended up being the CEO of Lucent and now is, on the board of HP and Merck and a whole bunch of companies. And they told me about this other woman who was this really interesting, very strong woman who was in charge of Lucent's biggest division, and her name is Carly Fiorina. And I interviewed Carly that day, and I was dazzled by her. And I came back, and Lucent was a very hot company then. And so we made Carly number 1. And we put her on the cover in September '98, and it was about 9 months later, in the summer of 1999, that she got recruited to be the CEO of Hewlett-Packard. But Carly had never been written about at that point, except for one little story in Investors Business Daily. So anyway, for Carly Fiorina fans out there, go ahead, thank me. And for those of you who don't really like her, go ahead, blame me.
So wait, I want to know, where did Pat Russo end up on the list?
Pat ended up, she was either 9 or 10.
How'd she feel about that?
I just saw Pat here 2 weeks ago in this hotel. She came to our Most Powerful Women Summit, and I kind of wanted to ask her about Carly. I don't know what their relationship is, and I never asked her how she felt about. She's a real classy person, so I don't think it really bothered her. Oprah was number 2 that year, by the way. We put Oprah at number 2. Yeah.
Interesting.
Wow. So speaking of gatherings of important women, earlier this year, Vogue published an article that opened with rumors about an elusive poker game hosted by a Manhattan tech tycoon had been swirling around for months. I'd first heard about it from a book publisher of my acquaintance, then from a German princess I met at a cocktail party, then from a Swedish banker, from the CEO of a global nonprofit. Was that you? From a TV personality. A women-only game held twice a year with money going to charity and friendships effortlessly forged. In certain circles, it was an evening marked on calendars months in advance. Some even jetted to New York to attend. Heidi, this sounds like quite the game. Tell us about this.
I'll give you an anecdote on the game. So the only men that are allowed to come are dealers. So they have to serve the women that are there. And I asked the assistant of Buzz Aldrin if he would do it, and he said he couldn't endorse gambling. So felt like, oh my gosh, I've
Wait, so will you tell them who you had to settle for then?
We had Shaquille O'Neal was one of the dealers, and Dick Parsons has been a dealer, and we got some really good ones at a game coming up. But the genesis of the game was that actually it started from my roots in law. When I was working in a law firm, it was a pretty dismal place for women. You could not fill a room like this for sure with amazing, powerful women then. And I looked towards the technology world as a place of hope because, I figured, okay, we're graduating 50% women from universities. There's no legacy. The revenue model isn't built on hours, so you wouldn't have this, horrible choice in your 30s of how do I manage having a family and becoming partner. And then I put my head down for 10 years and built this technology company and came up and said, where is everybody? What happened to all the women? And so the only thing I know how to do is what both Pattie and Julie have done extraordinarily well, is build networks. I build them from a technology perspective, and from watching the video in Kiva, that video gave me chills because when you look at the extreme exponential power networks have to change things, to me, I wanted to start something like that. And so I just got a group of my friends together. I couldn't get enough people in the technology industry who were senior enough. So we were just sort of this motley crew, kind of similar to how ChIPs started, it sounds like, although you're much more attractive and less motley. But I just started hosting these games in my house, and I was like, we don't want to exclude the men, but they kind of should know what it feels like to walk into a room and not be the alpha dog. And so I found a few brave men to come and be dealers, and then it just grew and grew and grew like networks do. Like the most powerful women's network.
Yeah, I came to one of yours.
And it's fun, right?
It was fun. It was strange and fun.
It's very strange. But the thing about it is that people get on board seats, companies get funded. It works. I heard someone here say this is just like the golf course, and it has a similar feel to it where people are having fun. It's very natural, but because everyone's sort of at a level where they can affect power in some way, they all end up helping each other. And that was really the intent of it going into it, and now it's just become gathered a life of its own. So,
one of the ways you described it is that for men, business happens a lot in a social setting, and we also heard Mary Cranston from the earlier panel talk about women having a lot of deeply personal relationships, but sometimes when you make that transition to business, it's sort of like, do you like me because you like me, or you like me because now you want something from me? So Julie, what's your thought there? And we are generalizing here, I admit, but are there differences between the way men do business versus the way women have traditionally been comfortable doing business? Or reframe it in a way that you would like to answer it.
Can I make up a different question?
You can completely do whatever you want.
You a politician.
I think it comes back to that men and women have been socialized with different playbooks. We both have sort of been taught playbooks for how to connect, how to form a tribe, a group, and I got the dude playbook, as you heard earlier. So I actually did not grow up with the women's playbook, and I had to sort of teach myself that later in life. But I think one of the interesting differences between the two, I think, is that the playbook the guys get, teaches them how to connect, have personal relationships, and then compete, and it's not personal, and they move more fluid. There's more fluidity in how they move in and out of that. And there's sort of a trust is assumed until it's broken, but if there's a fracture or if there's a falling out or a competition, they repair with fluidity, and it's interesting kind of what they get in that playbook. Women, it's, my sense is, and again, I didn't grow up with this playbook, so I had this totally wrong, but trust is earned. And actually the insight earlier about how when women are put in situations where they feel like they have to compete, that's when they end up, it brings out a different side of them because they really want to sort of be in a group together. I think that was a really key insight. So this idea of moving fluidly between competing and then having the relationships, I think, is something that is not as indoctrinated in the playbook. But what I will say is that the playbook we're collectively trying to put together is a playbook for how men and women work with each other. And I think we have an opportunity, actually, what we're trying to move to is a more humanistic model of working and playing together that is an integration of the masculine and the feminine. And I think some of the people that really best embody that, frankly, that I know are, it's the more evolved men who have that, and the women that can move more fluidly between those two worlds.
So Pattie, you've interviewed hundreds of successful men and women. Would love to hear your take.
Probably thousands.
Thousands.
At this point. I mean, seriously, I mean, I don't know, but I've been at Fortune for 31 years, so oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Julie's explanation, I totally agree with. You talked mostly about nurture. I think nature plays a part too. I mean, you know, men's and women's brains are different, and I've found over the years and I've really been interviewing men and women about power and leadership and how they lead for about the last 20 years. I've asked I've asked hundreds of women, what is power? And I've asked, you know, I don't know, many dozens of men, what is power? The answers are starkly different. Men's answers tend to be about sort of rank or position or control. A sort of classic answer is getting power is getting people to do things that they don't want to do. I've heard that from several men. And women tend to talk about influence, and women tend to think about power very horizontally and not so vertically. And power is about, you know, it's kind of distributed, and it's about having an impact on many things, because we tend to think about more things, and our brains are actually, you know, designed to let us think about more things. And so I do think that limits women from attaining very senior positions, because, and that's not necessarily a negative, really. We just care about different things. I mean, right now there are 22 female Fortune 500 CEOs, and that's down from 26 a couple of years ago, which is a very discouraging trend if that's, you know, if that's the only thing we focus on. I mean, we literally, like last week, Ellen Coleman, the CEO of DuPont, who was one of like sort of our hero female Fortune 500 CEOs, because she had a really good performance at DuPont, and she's just a really good person, an impressive woman. She got into a big battle with Nelson Peltz, the activist investor, who has had a habit the last couple of years of going after female, women-led companies. And she actually won a big battle against him in terms of, you know, he didn't get a position on the board and but he lost the battle, and he continued to put pressure on her, and she quit a couple weeks ago. She actually quit she stepped down like last Friday. So the numbers are not good in terms of women being in leadership positions in corporate America. But I do think it has a lot to do with, you know, a lot more to do with women's choices and the way women think about their careers and our careers in power, in addition to bias and this narrower band of acceptable behavior that we're all judged by.
So one of the things we've discussed at ChIPs is that there seems to be a pattern for many of us. In the first sort of 10 to 12 to sometimes 15 years, it seems that you do good work, you keep your head down, you're going to be rewarded, you'll get steadily promoted, you believe that the world is a meritocracy until the moment you realize it may not be. And around that point, and oftentimes in law firms, it's about that time that you make partner, and suddenly you're left to fend for yourself because no one actually wants to share the profits with you anymore. And so have you seen this happening? All three of you are incredibly successful in your career. Is this unique to law? Have you guys experienced this have you experienced? Can you hear me? Have you experienced this moment? And was there a shift when you realized you needed to do something differently? So I'll look at you, Julie.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I did go through a transition. I'd say when I was first, and I went from being I think a lot of us might go through this, the star athlete, to being a first-time executive, where you keep doing the things that got you there, the success behavior. Success behavior is very hard to abandon. And all of a sudden, no one told you the game changed. So it's kind of like going from what it takes to be a great athlete to being a great manager or coach. And so in hindsight, it took a pretty spectacular sort of failure point for me to start connecting the dots on what had happened there. And so a lot of, I was fortunate enough to have mentors that had cleared the way for me and bosses when I was in my star athlete hard charging mode. And I had kind of a take no prisoners style of working, and I got stuff done, and I was always, this disruptive force even before I became an entrepreneur. And that had been rewarded, and I had seen change, and so that was my playbook. And then all of a sudden, as a young executive, I was driving my team the same way, and we were having huge market success, but it was, I had a demoralized team. I realized I'd taken them on a forced march, and I think I started to get a sniff that there was a mutiny being planned. But it was a huge wake-up call, and what was striking to me is no one came along and said, hey, this is a different way of now being effective as a leader. And that was my first leadership lesson, which is you can be a leader, kind of a thought leader, I think, when you're not leading people, and that's a certain set of things, but then when you're leading people, it's a lot more about motivation, about building alliances, 360 alliances, with peers, et cetera, so there's a whole different set of rules. And I think that, the mentorship, sponsorship are vital at that moment in time, and it's a lot of what inspires me to do the work that I do now, advising entrepreneurs when they're going through those transitions.
The way that you described it when we were talking earlier, I thought was very appropriate and very vivid, which is, it seems that many of us in our careers experience that fall from grace moment where you go from that star athlete to, okay, it's not working. But I think that, how many here have actually experienced that fall from grace moment? So Heidi, you've kind of taken
Can I just comment on that, though? Because you and I talked about this at the Most Powerful Women Summit, and I haven't been able to get the thought out of my head. Because I actually do think it's something that is more acutely experienced by women. Even thinking about if you took like Leona Helmsley and Martha Stewart and you put them in a blender and made them a man, they'd be Donald Trump, right? And like for them it meant prison, for him it meant running for president. So I think that there's actually like a real risk that happens when, that fable where the horse has wax wings and they get too close to the sun. I mean, I think it's much more acutely experienced by women because you're defying expectations. And you see it now with Elizabeth Holmes, right? I mean, she's, the sort of glee that is associated with, her, oh my gosh, a Silicon Valley company that inflated its value. Like that's so stunning to people. And I mean, just sort of watching that whole trajectory, I think it's in the back of, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's in the back of many women's minds. As you succeed, you're kind of playing two games at once of how do you get people's expectations to match the reality of where you are without having them try to change that reality. And I think that's a pretty tough balance.
Yeah. Pattie, anything to add there?
No, I think you said it well.
We're all thinking whether Pattie's going to put in the story become Donald Trump. I love that. So, Pattie, you recently wrote an article responding to Anne Marie Slaughter's book, and you entitled it, because Pattie's never one to avoid conflict, What Anne Marie Slaughter Misses About Why Women Aren't Reaching the Top. And she wrote about 3 pivot points in a woman's career. I won't talk about the first 2, but the third occurs.
We'll mention the first 2 because they're interesting.
Why don't you mention the first 2?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to remember really, but but I'll try. And Mallun can.
Yeah, I'll correct you.
But are you you're familiar with Anne Marie Slaughter and the Why Women Can't Have It All article in the Atlantic 3 years ago, and she just came out with Unfinished Business, which is basically her sort of extended argument for this, and a call for paid family leave, changes in laws, changes in corporate policies to bring the U.S. up to the standards of other countries that are actually supporting women in ways that the U.S. and corporate America are not. So Anne Marie, who I really, really admire and know well, positions her sort of argument basically saying that if only we did all these things, we would come close to gender parity. And my argument against that is back to what I said earlier, which is that women think differently about power, women think differently about their careers, no matter how you change the laws, how you change the policies. It's putting in paid parental leave will help the working middle class and the lower class, and it's really not going to make a big difference to the women in this room, I believe. And sort of more than that, I had just had lunch a couple of days before I wrote that with a woman named Sally Blount, who is the dean of the Kellogg School at Northwestern. Really, really smart woman who is actually a psychologist by training. I mean, she has her whatever degree. And she thinks about this. So she said that, and she studied this, and women coming out of, I know you have it in your notes, Mal, and women coming out of college tend to go into careers that are much less competitive than male graduates do, to a very large, significant degree.
So 60% of the students, while they tend to outperform men in the classroom, they are 50% less likely than their male peers to enter competitive fields after graduating.
Yeah.
So you call that the first pivot point.
That's the first pivot point. And then the second pivot point is when women are in their 30s, when they weigh the opportunity to advance in their career against the hassle it's going to cause, right?
Right. It's the focus on how much easier tomorrow would be if they were not enduring the working mother struggle.
Yeah. Literally tomorrow. Like, I can't do that this year without thinking longer term. And that's a very practical way to think, and you can hardly criticize that. And then the third pivot point is, you tell me.
I sound so articulate because I'm reading what Pattie actually wrote. If a woman's career trajectory has carried her to the cusp of senior leadership.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting point.
To the cusp of senior leadership. So many women I know, so many women who I've interviewed who are on our most powerful women list or used to be because they didn't take that last promotion that would have made them the CEO of a public company, because they just don't really want to do it. They want to do something else. And so I'm a big fan and supporter of what Sheryl Sandberg says about, let's think about ambition differently, and let's think about taking risk in our career much more courageously, and let's lean in. But I'm even more for women making the choices that we want to make, and that is real power.
If women and young people, millennials, which means the majority of the population, are actually kind of saying, you know what, we want to disrupt this system. We want it different. And so what you do when you disrupt, actually, is you don't go straight into it and disrupt it. They're kind of the late adopters, the laggards. You kind of go in your own sandbox, at kind of more greenfield, and you start there, which is why more businesses are started by women in the U.S. than ever before, and they're large because they opt out of the system, like you're kind of talking about, and they go do this. And what's interesting is there's a growing number of men who also are saying, you know what, that system isn't so great. Whether they're taking companies private again because they don't like the brutal short-term mindset of public markets. I have a CEO who I've known a long time and have advised. I had lunch with him. He sold his company for over $1 billion in the past year. And I had lunch with him, and he said, come to my home. And I go to his house, and he's tending to his garden. He's found a way to now work at home part of the time. And he's telling me stories about his kids, and he makes us lunch. We sit out under the redwoods, and he's very philosophical about what he wants to do next. He's a young guy, by the way. And he looks a lot like those women that we say are lacking in ambition. And he's sitting there saying, you know, I actually want to go back to school and become a doctor and work with Doctors Without Borders. And so it's an interesting thing where it gets back to, are we searching for a frame that's more about mission than ambition? And are we all doing that in our own way? And I think that the men who have sort of been indoctrinated and normalized in this system of power and ambition, because power, the pure definition of power from a sociological perspective is that power is enforcing your will on others. It is that definition that you were told. It's like, we're not living in an era today where we want to do that anymore. Like Maslow's hierarchy, we're not in a food and shelter mode anymore. We're still working from that primal part of our brain. How do we move up that chain? So I guess what I'm saying, a long way of saying, is that I think there is a hunger for meaning, a hunger for mission versus ambition, a hunger to redefine power in a way that is much more evolved and modern. And I think that the men, frankly, are leading lives of quiet desperation because they're trapped in the system and they themselves want to break out of it as well. And the generations, the younger generation is starting to do that because they're looking at all of us and saying, if that's your idea of success, no, thank you. We'll come up with our own. And that's why you get the hipster movement, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't mean to get on my soapbox, but I think
really
that's sort of...
really insightful.
Okay, as a journalist, I cannot sit up here and not ask a question. So I need to ask Heidi a question, which is, do you find, Heidi, that women entrepreneurs tend to think smaller than male entrepreneurs in general?
I feel like this is a weighted question.
No, I have a view, but you're an entrepreneur.
Okay, I'll ask you the question after.
I would say if I had to pick the flaw of the women entrepreneurs who pitch me, that would be the primary flaw. So it's not the business idea, it always makes sense. The numbers always make sense. The pitch is perfect. But the business idea, I can't wrap my arms around how is this going to meaningfully change the world in some big way. The flaw on the male side is there are a lot more dumb ideas that are pitched in a big way. So,
Oh my gosh.
I'm so glad you said
so
that.
it's not that one is better than the other, it's just a different flaw, if that makes sense.
That's fascinating. Well, I just know what I've read about, and I talk about this when I give speeches about. I mean, I've always been intrigued that there are no female Mark Zuckerbergs or Larry Page and Sergey Brin and Elon Musks and on the horizon. And the only one that really came along and we thought, wow, maybe this is it, is Elizabeth Holmes.
Yeah.
And Theranos, for those of you who have not been reading the Wall Street Journal and the controversy over her, blood testing company.
Pretty sure everyone in this room knows who she is.
I guess so, yeah. This lawyer crowd would know, yeah. But why is that? Let's discount Elizabeth Holmes because we can't figure her out right now. But why is that? And studies by all sorts of consulting firms show that male entrepreneurs say the number one reason they start companies is to make a lot of money. The number one reason that women start companies, or right up there, is women want to create the companies they want to work for. And often those companies are fairly small. They're dropping out of a Fortune 500 company, and I just want to create a company that is, I think in a lot of cases, kind of cozier.
It's a great question. I've thought about this a lot, and I think that my theory is that what's going on actually starts very early on, which is the way that women and boys are socialized. It's boys will be boys, girls better be good. And basically the implicit message in that is that if you take risks, you break shit, you are messy, you break the rules, it's okay. If a girl does that, it is punishing. And so So it does not create an appetite for being bold, being crazy, thinking big, and it creates a pragmatism of I'm only going to talk about what I can do. And I know I can get from point A to point B, so I'm going to talk about that. But I'm not going to talk about going from point A to point Z because I can't see it. And that's the aspiration of an entrepreneur who thinks bold and big. It requires
You're going to break things.
You're going to break things, and you got. So I think this is an area where how do we teach women entrepreneurs to be more aspirational, and to be bolder, and to be crazier, with that pragmatism? Because when you have the tension of the two, that's where a brilliant entrepreneur comes to the.
So I could talk to you guys for hours, but I'm going to ask one final wrap-up question, and I'm going to channel my best Pattie Sellers, but I'm actually going to give you a choice, which is the final question is something that I know that you've studied, and one question that you ask a lot, which is, and I'm going to start with you, Pattie, which is you can choose between, or a hybrid of the two. Are you ambitious, or what does power mean to you?
Okay. Well, I'm going to take the second one because this is very meaningful to me, and I've been rethinking it actually since I was here 2 weeks ago. I asked, so my favorite definition of power until a couple of years ago was something that Oprah said to me when I asked her years ago, what is power? And she, at the time, she really didn't like the word, and she was sort of struggling with it, but she said, power to me is the ability to impact with purpose. And I always really liked that. I thought that was great. And then I came to my own new definition of power, which was sort of fortified 2 weeks ago here on this stage, I guess in this room. I was interviewing Megyn Kelly from Fox News. And we walked out on stage, and I actually didn't know what my first question to her was going to be, and I just decided to go for it, and sat down, I go, Megyn, what is power to you? She gave the greatest answer. She said, power to me is freedom. It's choice. It's not needing my job. I love my job, I want to keep my job, but if I lose my job, it's not really going to make a difference because I have other things going on. And so I love this because I've actually been saying for the last couple of years in speeches when I speak about women in power and leadership, this is the true test of power is real power is what you do outside your job description, outside your official platform, beyond your tenure. And the real test is, if you lost your job this afternoon, would you still be powerful? If you can say yes, then you have real power. So that's my definition.
That's great. Heidi, you have a choice, ambition or power?
I can do a hybrid, right? So to play off of one thing Pattie said, I actually am building a multi-billion-dollar business, so I'm very proud of that, and I guess that makes me very ambitious, and I'm also proud of that because I think I owe it to the Ruth Bader Ginsburgs, I owe it to my mom, I owe it to my daughter to show them that women can do anything that they set their mind to. I also want to make sure I use every dollar of that education I invested in and make a return on it that's worth it. So yes, I am ambitious. And then on the power question, for me, it is about being able to influence outcomes, which is sort of a take on Megyn's answer, which is if I see a situation that I don't like, having the ability to fix it. And that feels like a very powerful position to be in when you can either make a phone call or invest money in something or help a friend out in a way that they couldn't do without you. That to me is power.
Great. Julie?
So I'll start with the ambition question. So the ambition to me is, I think that the reason it's fraught, and a lot of people have trouble with it, which I do as well, is ambition puts self at the center, whereas aspiration or mission is kind of more of an other-centeredness. It's sort of say, I'm part of something bigger than myself. There's a future I want to create. There's a reality that I want to be in service to that's bigger than me. And so that's the frame that I resonate more with. In terms of power, I would say that I've always thought of power as a means to an end, not an end unto itself. And I think often we talk about it like it's an end unto itself. And I think, frankly, that there's a wisdom in the fact that women have a distaste towards that definition that we should listen to, which is, what is the role of power? The role of power is it's to influence, it's to move people to your point of view. But I'm most interested in purposeful power. That how do you, and I think what you said is so right on, which is, it's about authentic power. We're so hungry for authentic power, not extrinsic power. I've got leverage on you and I can make you do something. It's how do I influence you, inspire you to draw the best of yourself out in service to something that we collectively, a future that we want to go toward. And I think that's why we elected President Obama. I think that's kind of the model of power that we're wanting to move towards. I do ultimately think it's about authentic power and power as a tool to create some sort of a future.
Thank you. Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And we are the last panel of the day. We're going to have a wrap up with Emily, but please give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mallun.
Thanks, Mallun. That was good.
Nice job.